Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture on the Dead Poets Society. So, the reason I assigned this film to you for this week ought to be pretty obvious, what with the prolific references to Whitman and other Romantic poets throughout. There is really no piece of pop culture that has popularized the work of Walt Whitman more than this movie. As Luke Buckmaster of The Guardian has pointed out, thanks to this film, for a whole generation, the line, "O Captain, my Captain," evokes not the poem from which it originated, Walt Whitman's 1865 elegy to the then recently assassinated Abraham Lincoln, but actor Robin Williams. In fact, when Robin Williams died by suicide in 2014, "O Captain, my Captain" was a trending hashtag on Twitter. What I want to do in this lecture is to link the film to the reading assignment from Jacques Barzun's classic Romantic and Modern, and to provide for the Dead Poet Society the kind of defense that Barzun provides for Romanticism as a whole. As is true of pretty much everything we are going to discuss this term, I suspect that many of you are going to have critical things to say about this film. I expect there to be a variety of reactions. And many of the critiques will be absolutely valid. As a coming of age drama, this has a certain naivete and idealism about it. Mr. Keating's methods as a teacher are certainly up to, available for criticism. In addition to being overly and perhaps improperly involved in his students' lives, what Keating teaches isn't so much genuine literary criticism, but perhaps, as Kevin Detmar wrote in The Atlantic, the literary equivalent of fandom. And it's a film that hasn't aged particularly well given the cultural politics of the United States today, because in it, a group of wealthy young white men are liberated by reading the work of dead white men. So I can let you elaborate on those critiques over the next week. I expect we'll have a very interesting discussion on Thursday. But what I want to do here is to briefly explain where I think this film is coming from and why it became a classic for people who saw it in 1989. So, the script for Dead Poet Society was written by Tom Schulman, who won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, and it was based on his own teenage experiences at an elite boarding school in Tennessee and an inspirational teacher named Samuel Pickering, who's now a university professor. Set in 1959, it dramatizes a transitional moment in America between the heavily conformist 1950s and the radical 1960s. If there ever was a classical period in the United States outside of the 18th century, it was probably the 1940s and 1950s. This is also roughly the same time when the second edition of Jacques Barzun's book on Romanticism was published, which is 1961. The first edition was published in 1943. And Barzun, as which you can probably tell this from the chapter, he's defending Romanticism from critics of it, especially from critics who he thinks interpret Romanticism in an incorrect or an overly simplified way, who kind of strawman Romanticism. But by 1961, when the second edition came out, Romanticism's reputation was improving, and we were on the cusp of a much more romantic era in American culture. He saw evidence for this, early evidence of this, not only among his colleagues at Columbia University, whose attitudes about Romanticism were changing, but also in the art that emerged in the wake of the Second World War. In the final chapter of this book, which I didn't assign, so you won't recognize this quote, he said that the Second World War and its aftermath showed that Romanticism had still one more charge in its belly. The events and implications of armed conflict reawakened the deep and vivid emotions that a time of peace, wit, and satire tends to repress. The ideas attached to this rebirth of feeling naturally bore upon the fate of the individual and took the familiar form of a feud against society. Barzun named figures like Allen Ginsberg and Henry Miller, who at the time were already giants of the literary avant garde. But the world had not yet seen the total transformation of elite and popular culture that would occur over the next decade. It was still very much in its beginning. Not only art, but literary criticism would be forever changed. This was the rise of rock music, of the beat poets, who we will talk about in a couple of weeks, the hippies, pop art, and experimental literature. Literary criticism of the 1940s and the 1950s had been dominated by formalist approaches, which prescribed these very precise and exacting analyses of a text, especially a poem's structure and meaning. The kind of close reading we did with Dickinson and Whitman is kind of an inheritance of this formalist approach. And we get a parody of it, a very extreme version of it, in the fictional essay by J. Evans Pritchard from the famous scene in the film where Robin Williams tells his students to rip out the whole section of their textbook. So in the 1960s, New Historicism became the ascendant school of literary and cultural criticism, and it involved exploring the historical and cultural context of a work and how its context informs the content and the form of a work of art. This is what Barzun is doing in his book, and essentially what I am doing right now in this lecture. In summary, this point between the 1950s and the 1960s marks a major transition in Western culture, both at the popular and at the intellectual levels. We can see Dead Poet Society as a dramatization of that transition in the form of a coming of age story. The boys in this boarding school are products of the deeply conservative culture of what we call New England WASPs, and WASP, WASP, stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. The parents of these boys were the generation that fought the Second World War and are participating in the post war economic boom in the United States. They likely also have memories of the Great Depression from when they were children. And these boys are being educated at a school that's steeped in these age old traditions that we see from the very beginning, what with the bagpipes and the church services and all of that. We see that learning there is done by rote, and that they are being prepared for exactly the same very practical but somewhat prosaic professions, medicine, banking, law, that their fathers pursued before them. The coming 1960s will absolutely shock and offend these parents. They have no idea what is coming for them. Mr. Keating, therefore, enters their lives as kind of a harbinger of what is to come. And he encourages these young men to essentially live according to the values of the Romantic poets. So, in the chapter I had you read, Barzun gives a couple of different versions of the meaning of a romantic life. One sense of the term is living the kind of life that makes the production of art possible. The other is really a theory of life, quote, born of spiritual insight, in which one is to learn things by experience rather than from authority. In the online discussion forum, I would like us to talk about how the film asks us to think about this. Are these boys really supposed to become artists, or is this more about an overall theory of life that kind of regardless of your occupation? How do the students interpret what Mr. Keating teaches them, and is this consistent with our understanding of romanticism so far and with our understanding of the values of the poets that he is teaching them? Is he interpreting them accurately? The story is set in 1959, like I said, but the film was actually released in 1989, 30 years later. And you can look at late 1980s, early 1990s as either as kind of an extension or like the last gasp of what happened in the 1960s, or perhaps as some separate, rather smaller and quieter romantic moment in American culture, occasioned by the end of the Cold War. The people watching this film when it was released were older versions of the students in this film. You know, those kids 30 years later, some of them may have been dreamers and radicals, and but it's important at the same time to remember that not every young American in the 1960s was a hippie. Some of them would go on to support the Republican conservative candidate Barry Goldwater, who ran against Lyndon Johnson, and then Richard Nixon, and then Ronald Reagan, and become the vanguard of the new conservative movement in the United States, which was an explicit reaction to the tumult and disorder of the 60s. The 1970s and the 1980s in the US and in Western Europe saw the ascendance of neoliberalism and the suppression of a lot of the radical energy from the decade prior. So, in the youth culture of the late 80s and the early 90s, you can see a return of this idea of rejecting authority and traditional forms of success and achievement. We can see the case for this in the emergence of Generation X heroes like Kurt Cobain, who was the frontman for the band Nirvana, and which kind of represented a music culture that demonized, quote, selling out, which meant sacrificing your artistic values for the sake of signing with a major record label, giving up your art for profit, essentially. And this idea of selling out was itself kind of a reaction to the fact that many of the big rock stars from the 1960s had kind of gone corporate. They'd all wound up signing up with major music companies and getting big record deals and going on to make lots and lots and lots of money. And it was seen as these artists kind of giving up what made them special, giving up what made them anti system, and becoming instead part of the system, getting co opted. Other examples of this kind of ethos would be like the early films of Richard Linklater, who made the independent film Slacker in 1990, or the films of Kevin Smith, which you may be familiar with. He made the low budget black and white comedy film Clerks in 1994. And both of these films raised kind of the low achieving 20 something to the level of a hero. And the class enemy for um, this version of youth culture was the yuppie, the young urban professional who drank Starbucks and listened to pop music and was a Wall Street broker and was influenced by corporate advertising. If you have seen the David Fincher film Fight Club or read the Chuck Palahniuk novel on which it is based, you can see it as either the perfect distillation of this ethos, this kind of anti consumerist, anti authority, anti tradition ethos of the 80s and 90s, or as a satire on it. Um, During this period, you also saw the emergence of new values in literary criticism, which had begun rejecting the traditional canon in favor of a more inclusive one that featured writers who were not all white men. And the paradigm had shifted from new historicism towards what was called critical theory, much of which was influenced by the new cultural values around race, class, and sexuality. So it was in some ways an extension of 1960s political values into the academic realm. Um, so, from the vantage point of 1989, this film is both weirdly traditional in that it's a straightforward mass market film that champions the art of 19th century English poets, and also rather timely. It offered a mode of rebellion against the conformism and triumphalist capitalism of the post Cold War Reagan Bush era. And it was also a break from the more cynical and irony drenched aspects of late 80s popular culture. The youth culture of the 1980s could be a little bit nihilistic and alienated, taking some of its values from European punk rock. And this is a film that is deeply sincere and earnest in its values, and therefore kind of a more refreshing, even though there's a fairly sad ending, somewhat more idealistic take on these same ideas. This film would have offered nostalgia to an older generation for the time when they were idealistic and maybe even radical kids. And while it probably inspired not a few teenagers to study literature, the people who didn't like this film were essentially professional literary critics. And interestingly, I find that young people today tend to be a lot more critical of it than my generation was. And partly for that reason, because the responses are so different, I'm kind of on the fence about whether our present moment can be called particularly romantic historically, either in the US or generally. I think there's some evidence for it in political culture, but I don't really see it yet in art or in culture in general. And that's one reason I suspect why this film seems a little bit dated and maybe a little bit naive in its outlook. This is a period with multiple crises. You can date the start of that back to the 2008 global financial crisis or to 9/11 and the war on terrorism, depending on your perspective. But romantic moments usually seem to come after the revolution or immediate crisis has passed. Barzoon says of the original Romantic period that the critical philosophers of the 18th century had destroyed their own dwelling place. The next generation must build or perish. Whence we conclude that Romanticism is first of all constructive and creative. It is what may be called a solving epoch, as against the dissolving 18th centuries. Um, I don't know for sure, but it kind of feels to me like we're still in a moment of dissolving, of old foundations being disturbed and institutions torn down. If it seems kind of dumb at this point to go into the woods and recite 19th century poetry to each other, it might be because it doesn't really feel safe to do that right now. It could be your generation a little bit later, or it may even be the next one that does. So this brings us to a conclusion for this week. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing this all with you in the forum thread.